Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller.
Today we will follow the money of who is funding the radical pro Palestinian protests on campus and in our streets, as well as funding the influences in classrooms and social media. Our guest is Kristen Eastlick, Senior Vice President at the Capital Research Center in Washington, D.C. She's going to fill us in on this often hidden money trail. Kristen, welcome, and thank you so much for coming on our show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So as a mystery book fan, I want to know, how does the Capital Research Center operate to find these money trails?
Sure. Well, we do focus on looking at the kind of politically active or politically influential. And when I say that, I do mean small p as much as I do large p. It's mostly we try to look at the issue influencers that are out there, but often there are connections. But we really start with the publicly available information. So most organizations have to be recognized. If you want to get donations and not have to pay taxes, I know you're familiar with this. We also are one of those groups. We're a think tank. You have to register with the IRS. So you have to, in order to not have your contributions taxed, the exchange is financial information. So every year, most organizations have to report a lot of their activities, their finances, what they're doing, how their boards work to the Internal Revenue Service. And that is how you get a lot of information. You can also look to see where groups are registered to do business. You can do a lot of understanding where groups, the kinds of chapters that groups have. If you, let's say, if you want to raise money from somebody in, say, Virginia, you actually have to register in Virginia as a nonprofit organization. And so there's a track record of where a corporation, an organization operates, and nonprofits have a special set of regulations they have to follow.
Okay, here's my question though.
Yeah.
IRS is American, United States.
Yes. That's the tax revenue.
Yes. Internal Revenue Service. So what I want to know is, how do you track money, let's say, from Qatar?
Correct, which is a huge challenge. There is some legislation out there that does track or requires some institutions to post that. For example, at the $250,000 level, which is very large, money received from foreign entities does have to be tracked by universities, and there's a mechanism for that. Although I do believe the database that discloses that was recently taken down, which is a different set of questions altogether. So there already is some mechanism for that, but by and large, the IRS and many people in the United States have privileged donor privacy, which we also do very strongly. The challenge becomes the foreign component of that. So money that flows through foundations, that has to be disclosed. But this extra money flowing from international groups it can come in if it's given by an individual as an individual and donor protected contribution or transaction. So that can be difficult.
In other words, there is mostly tax information available that is openly accessible. Is that what you're saying?
There is some information that is openly accessible by when the contributions come from inside the United States.
Okay.
Now, if those contributions, if money has entered in outside, it's a lot more difficult to track. And I know we can talk about this further, but there is some legislation out there where there's an attempt. There are already some existing laws that do require, if you're acting as a foreign agent, to have to disclose that in some way. It's called the Foreign Agent Reporting Act, FARA. People use as that term. However, it's a complicated regulation for people. People follow it very differently. Sometimes an individual who registers or doesn't register can be strategic about their choices. And so there has been a big discussion in Capitol Hill about reform of that registration requirement and some requirements on nonprofits that operate, particularly in this space, particularly in the discussion right now of the pro-Hamas groups that are out there, or the protests that are happening on college campuses. That has triggered a lot of questions in this realm.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Who are the major donors in the United States and abroad
Sure.
that are injecting money in these pro-Hamas and anti-Zionist activism and propaganda in the West?
Sure, sure. Let me start first by explaining why that there's another element of this being difficult to track. So let's say you have a great idea to start up a new nonprofit organization. But you don't know anything about bookkeeping, you don't know anything about hiring, you don't know anything about the business of running a nonprofit. Well, sometimes there are entities out there that offer a thing called fiscal sponsorship. So you can then fiscally sponsor a group. You as long as it fits in with your mission and your purpose, you can then give that organization all the help it needs. You can have a bank account sort of through your bank account set aside to receive money. You can help them do hiring. You can help them fill out their tax forms. So this fiscal sponsorship is something it's common in the world of IRS. However, that opens up certainly a door for abuse. Ideally, you'd think, okay, you're a fiscal sponsor for a few years. Once the organization realizes that it has enough support in the world and enough money coming in to do the administrative stuff, you'd think it would spin off. Well, unfortunately, a lot of these groups that are out there, I'll start naming a couple now. One is the Students for Justice in Palestine. It actually is sponsored by an organization called Westpac. It's a New York-based fiscal sponsor. So if you wanted to say, well, who's on the board of the Students for Justice in Palestine? You don't know. You only know who is on the board of Westpac and who has set up this opportunity for a group to be incubated. Well, what we do know is that the Students for Justice in Palestine was set up by the American. I always use the acronyms too. But an American Muslim group is out there that is really doing most of the funding. AMP is the Americans for Muslims in Palestine. That's the group that has kind of helped start it and helped found the initial organizations.
You mean
again,
Westpac? Initially founded Westpac.
US-based. These are all, anything I'm going to mention is probably US-based.
Just let me clarify.
So the money comes mostly from American Muslims for Palestine?
AMP has received a lot of donations that we know do go to the Students for Justice in Palestine. But let's say we only know about some of these larger sources, let's say about $1 million right now that came into AMP and Westpac since 2010, which is when a lot of these were founded. So among the top providers are entities like the Elias Foundation. They've given $100,000 to Westpac. The Spark Plug Foundation, $100,000 to Westpac. Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, that's $80,000 that went to Westpac. Open Society, which is a Soros foundation for Open Society, that's again $40,000, and Groundswell Foundation. But anything else that may have come in through individuals, you can't easily track like that because that information is not shared with the public. So those are some of the larger.
Before you say that, I just wanted to clarify what you said, because you said it quickly, and I think it's an interesting manipulation. So if Students for Justice in Palestine, after its incubation period, would have then severed, didn't need its fiscal sponsor anymore, then they would have a board that then they could be tracked.
Yes.
But by staying, you said this, but I want to emphasize this.
Yep.
By staying under the shelter when they don't need to, they are hiding what they're doing or where they're getting their funds.
That is how I see that after a certain number of years. I can be an advocate for small nonprofits to get started, but once you're a really formalized nonprofit, I have a hard time justifying fiscal.
Students for Justice in Palestine has 200 branches in America on 200 universities, so they're not small.
Yeah, but their board is not public. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yes, there is whatever requirement Westpac makes on Students for Justice in Palestine to disclose its activities, just so that Westpac can file its own tax forms, there really are no guidelines for that. It is a project of, and as long as Westpac is fulfilling its IRS status, IRS obligations, it's
Tax
doing the
obligations.
job for
Yeah.
these projects.
They're
There are
hiding the money.
increasing number of entities. So let's talk about some of the other groups that you see a lot at the protest or have ginned up a lot. The Answer Coalition. It is also and I never remember the acronym, but it's an anti-war coalition. It actually is also a fiscal sponsor or a fiscal grantee. It does not exist on its own. The People's Forum is another incubator. It's an idea incubator, and it has been promoting a lot of these smaller local groups, but you don't really have a lot of information about which groups they're incubating. They're doing a lot of the registration for some of the groups that, whether they're protesting here and have to get a permit or whether they're protesting someplace else.
So there are a lot of these names I've never heard of. Are there well-known names? You just mentioned a few earlier in this interview, but like big donors to
The big donors that are doing a lot of the incubation are places like the Tide Center. Now I can't even tell you how many branches the Tide Center has, but it has been the source of sort of far left money. And I say far left, some of it is center left. It's just more on the progressive side of the aisle, and they have multiple entities. It's a just huge foundation that helps in one of its groups is really focused on helping other groups function. And so it sets up a lot of fiscal sponsorships. It actually, I think, was one of the first organizations to really do a lot of fiscal sponsorship. So Tides is a big one. Again, Rockefeller Brothers. We have also tracked Code Pink is a very active group.
I've heard of that. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure.
The name
Code
of
Pink is a woman's anti-war group, and I can say that you might see them. They will go walk up to legislators and ask them for comment or ask them for what they're doing to stop what they call the genocide in Gaza. So and they try to pin a lot of politicians into corners. They happen to be their founder is actually married to a billionaire. His name is Nevik Roy Singham. And there's a lot of evidence to show that money probably has gone into them from his, billionaire worth. And he has a lot of ties to the Chinese party. In fact, the New York Times did a recent expose on him, and Code Pink has been all over the protests, particularly at the schools and at state capitals and places like that.
Okay, so that's Code Pink, the Tides Foundation,
Mm-hmm.
the Rockefeller group, then Ford Foundation, maybe?
I don't know that I have seen a lot of Ford Foundation. What they tend to fund, they tend to fund a lot of social justice activism that lives in the same neighborhood. I don't know that I've seen direct Ford Foundation money going to this type of more aggressive protest, but there's an increasing connectivity between some of these groups. You've seen a lot of LGBTQ groups that are protesting in solidarity with the Palestinians. So of course, we know that Ford has given money to a lot of the LGBTQ groups. So there's a lot of shared concentric circles.
Okay.
Can I wait? I want one more question.
Go ahead. Sure.
Can anyone become a fiscal sponsor? So let's roll back just a little.
Sure.
So
we have a couple of things happening. Like, again, in this ecosystem, there are a lot of groups that are supportive of, a more far left worldview, and they have groups like this on more of the conservative side of the aisle as well. I don't want to make it sound like this is just used by one or the other. There's just a lot more advocacy money on the left than the right in general, and there are a lot more groups. I can point to some research we've done on that as well. So, and there are some entities that actually set up shop specifically to be a fiscal sponsor. So they offer their services. Do you have a great nonprofit idea? You can use our services. When it comes to more of the ideological things like this, it does tend to be specific people who, or you do tend to find the same fiscal sponsor within that. if that makes sense. Like they will probably go to the Tides Foundation first instead of going to, say, one of the many it's the number of fiscal sponsor organizations are growing. I don't know that I want to say exponentially, but I have tried to look to see how many are listed. There's actually a foundation, an association for fiscal sponsors. There's an association in this town for everything A, but I've been trying to see if the logos are growing on the directories of these fiscal sponsors. And I have a sense that they have been over the last few years. So that's
are you talking about still about pro-Palestinian activism?
I'm sorry?
Are you still talking about pro-Palestinian activism? Or
no, I'm talking about just generic fiscal sponsor.
Oh, no. Okay, let's go back to the pro-Palestinian activism. How much money is given by these big donors toward pro-Hamas and anti-Zionist activism in the West?
Again, you can't come up with one number, but these and so I'm so sorry, I keep saying it's impossible to tell.
No, but that's important that you say that so that we get that across.
Some of them are as small as, for example, we have one tract from Soros that's only $40,000 versus another from the I just named it, foundation, that was more $100,000. So they're usually in six figures. A lot of the larger ones are, if they're going to be tracked and picked up by the tax filings, they're going to be the larger, more substantial donations.
Yep. Who are the activists or activist groups and influencers that are receiving this money?
Right. That's what I was mentioning. The U.S. Palestinian Community Network, for example, is one of the big organizers. I mean, it would be, I think, at this point impossible. We have been, well, to sidetrack a tiny bit for that, but Capital Research Center in 2017 launched a website called Influence Watch, where we have been trying to track the public policy groups of all color, whether it's those that are trying to change economic policy or change other types of policy. It's US, it's focused on US. We're looking at a lot of the foundations that give money. So having Influence Watch out there has gotten us to learn a lot about all of these movements. Well, when we made a decision in 2022 to build a Middle East public policy hub so that you could go kind of one-stop shopping for the different types of groups that are involved in this, I think I started with 200 groups. That number, since, and we have a great researcher on staff, his name is Ryan Morrow, and he has really been digging into a lot of these groups. He came with a lot of experience in domestic terrorism and in a lot of these domestic groups and some of their work overseas. He has now, that list is almost 1,000 groups that we've been tracking, that we've built it up to since we started doing this, and it's specifically since October 7th. Because seeing the groups that will align themselves in the protests, we will go and grab those lists and then try to start doing more of that work. So I think we now, at least 500 of the groups that we have on Influence Watch are specifically have been involved in some of the pro-Hamas work. And we cover a lot of the pro-Jewish groups as well, so that there's information on both sides to see who's having that commentary, who reacts in a way that then explains why they think that the protesters are not, helpful, not doing the right thing. But we also are trying to keep track of all of the groups out there that are kind of promoting particularly violence, particularly breaking into these schools, and trying to also even look at the legal support that those groups are getting. I mean, they're American Muslims for Palestine actually helps offer legal services to the student groups that are out there that do wind up getting jailed or detained or anything like that. National Lawyers Guild is one of the groups that offers a lot of support, legal support and defense to both the Palestinian movements on campus as well as Antifa. So they are really a part of that infrastructure as well. Do we know a lot about how those transactions happen? We know a far less amount about how those transactions happen, because think about how Antifa operates. It's all very under the radar. The payments are made in small dollars and quietly, so they don't wind up in a lot of the records that we can find and look at.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
So
count.
so
Count.
you just said you made an overview of organizations, and there are hundreds who are involved
Mhm.
in anti-Zionist, pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian activism. What about the pro-Israel
Mhm.
organizations? How many did you find there about?
So it's a much smaller percentage. When I was counting that hundreds to 200s, it was a good representative of that, but it is completely outnumbered by the new groups. I mean, I'd probably have added, I guess as a percentage, I would say that I'm going to say 40%, 30% of those groups are more on the pro-Israel side versus the I don't know how you want to say it, Palestinian or Hamas, because I do want to distinguish that.
Yeah, of
I
course.
know there are Palestinian groups out there that have not agreed with this. What we are really looking at are those that either, I mean, Student for Justice in Palestine set out a toolkit immediately after October 7th, where they gave people the language to use. And there is a sophistication of how they talk about their support of either Hamas or on some of the policies that are out there, where there are groups that are trying to say the right things whilst keeping their risk of involvement low for enforcement purposes. While there are some that are saying, I mean, I think SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, wound up saying that we are a part of this movement. We're not in solidarity. We are a part of this movement. And that's kind of hard to step back and say that, okay, so this means that you guys are holding hands with the activities that are out there. I mean, it's very hard for a group, I think, to point that doesn't mean we wholeheartedly support
Yeah.
some of the
Wait, I think
violence.
this is an important question I want to understand.
Mhm.
So the United States has list of terrorism organizations.
Yes.
So if a group is on that list, then can they legally still get money through these fiscal sponsors and everything?
They should not be able to do that. The IRS does, or there is existing legislation that prohibits, and now there's new legislation that wants to make it even harder and require more IRS enforcement of this activity. The challenge is that the IRS doesn't tend to enforce as much of the viewpoint activity, shall we say. Even something like that, it should be enforcing criminal conduct and the like. The challenge is that it is more likely to go after people who are not following financial regulations. That tends to be more of what they will go after. There hasn't been as much funding going to the IRS, partly because, and if you are on the right, you probably remember that there was a situation where the current or the previous IRS agent, the chief IRS agent, wound up putting a list of conservative groups on a list that they were supposed to be looking more closely at, which is, arguably targeting conservatives in a way that they were not targeting similar groups that were coming from the left. And when you looked at the list of those groups that were targeted, a handful were on the left of center, but the majority were on the right.
Yeah.
So there was a feeling. And so in response, there has been less interest in having the IRS enforce anything, because there's been a belief that those who are at the IRS have a bias against conservatives. So and
the IRS also apologized for that.
They did. They absolutely did. They absolutely did. And it's been a few years since that happened, but the tail end of that funding has not really, they've not gotten the funding to do that. And I think I read a publication by somebody who's been an IRS specialist for a very long time, and his perspective has been that there are fewer agents at the IRS who understand the intricacies of this nonprofit area of law, this tax exempt groups. Most of the IRS agents tend to be more in how to get more people to pay their taxes and how to do that kind of enforcement, versus the nuances of really looking, because there are, in actual fact, there are about 100 designations of IRS entities. Like most of us that are in this world know the term 501c3. That's
it's a nonprofit where donations towards that nonprofit can be can be deducted, how do you say,
Correct.
deducted from the donors'
So those are classified,
taxes.
yeah, as
Yeah.
full on.
But Kristen, before we go into all the details,
Okay,
too much maybe for the time we have available.
understood.
And although it's all very very interesting what you I mean we would need hours to
Yes,
to really understand this.
And it's a lot of nuances.
There is but for my understanding and maybe others understanding as well, American Muslims for Palestine is a big donor
Mhm.
towards pro Hamas or in solidarity with Hamas activities
Either
in the
infrastructure
West,
or
protests,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Where do they get the money from?
I mean, they also are getting their money from some of these foundations, but also it must be direct donations. Like we only know some of the funding of the American Muslims for Palestine.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you
But-
already mentioned that.
But you do, okay, wait, but universities frequently have endowed chairs, and that's legal. So a country such as Qatar can endow a chair at an Ivy League university, and that's totally legal. Is that correct?
I actually I know that there foreign funding that goes into to universities, absolutely. Again, if they're receiving it over a certain amount, that does have to be disclosed. And $250,000 is the current threshold. And there's legislation out there that would propose that be reduced substantially.
But that's 250,000 a year, right?
I believe so.
We
Yeah.
also know that a lot of universities omit to report that they get these large
This is the
donations
challenge
from abroad.
with, and this is all throughout the IRS. It is a challenge with a self-reporting situation and so there could be, and I'm sure there have been, complaints filed with the IRS that say we believe that this money or that these groups are supporting terrorism, things like that. So those complaints could be going into the IRS. Now, whether the IRS actually is responding to those, they have not since. They have not. I have not seen any movement towards this since October 7th, certainly. And there's very little enforcement before. In fact, there's just very little IRS enforcement of tax exempt issues.
Yeah. So what are the goals and motivations of the donors and entities that inject their money in pro-Hamas activism?
When you start seeing the donors, again, the ones that we do know about, certainly it's just the very direct supporting the protests on campus, supporting what is there. But you also look at the language. When you look at what the groups that they are supporting, the common thread is often an anti-American, certainly anti-West, anti-free thought. It can be anti-capitalism. You see a lot of socialist language. I mean, one of the groups that is heavily supported and connected with both the protests as well as the organizational structure is the Democratic Socialists of America. They are a large influencer in this space and have, in many cases, because they do operate on college campuses, there are a lot of campus chapters. They become a natural ally. So that's another group to sort of look and see, okay, who supports them and open up that dialogue. But there is definitely a sense of we should be supporting the destruction, certainly of Israel. It's not, and there's a lot of language that it's much less about opposing the policies of Israel. There is language that whether you're talking about from the river to the sea, whether you're talking about just eliminating Israel's existence. That is not an uncommon thread among some of these groups, and certainly the anti-American, certainly the we're coming on September 11th, right? So there is that language of we want to see some of the dismantling or destruction of America and the free thought that happens here. So it's I wish I could say that those are more common in the connections than they are uncommon.
Wow.
But what can be done about this funding, especially when you name major foundations that one would expect to be pro-democracy?
Sure.
Like
So-
some of those foundations that you named, like the Rockefeller Brothers.
So part of it is this exposure, right? Part of it is just showing that, hey, these are groups. I mean, I'm not sure if people who are supportive of who have been longtime funders of Tides. I should also mention one other thing that is a way of getting funding into this stream that is harder to track. Sort of backing up a little bit. There are entities out there called donor advised funds. And donor advised funds are run by Fidelity. They're run by Charitable Charles Schwab.
Yeah.
Everybody knows these bank names. And then there are others. There are Jewish community foundations. Those kind of function as donor advised funds. And you give, let's say you give $100,000 to this organization, and then you tell it, here's who we would like you to give money to. And then the organization continues to give money. But it looks like it's a donation only from the community foundation. It looks like a donation only from Fidelity. So you wind up looking to see Fidelity's list of entities to which it contributes, and it's hundreds of pages long, because all of the people who have that account then said, please, many people, and if they wanted to give to, say, one entity, you can see that. I don't know that I've seen a lot of Fidelity transactions to SJP or to Students for Justice in Palestine or to AMP or things like that, but it is possible that money could flow through that way.
And it's a way to hide.
It is absolutely a way to hide, a legitimate way, because there is.
No, I understand, but it's okay.
It is another way to hide.
Yeah.
So back to what can be done. And I think that the education piece has been so important, because without it, nobody's asking what can be done. I know that's a silly thing, but if you don't think that there's a problem to be enforced, you're never asking and pushing people to do said enforcement. So is the mere exposure of all of this going on and all the questions that are now coming from the public, from reporters, and from Congress, or even state legislatures, which we'll get to in a minute, enough to increase enforcement at the IRS? Because again, a lot of these become pressure systems, and then something has to happen. Can you imagine there was the hearing that took place where the presidents of the universities kind of acknowledged and had to be faced with what allowing those protests to continue, what that did. That created change that wouldn't have happened if the question wasn't originally asked. So the things that we've identified that people are working on are certainly there's a hammering for IRS enforcement of this. And that hammering is certainly coming from the people in Congress right now who are trying to push that to happen. And there's new legislation that would be more empowering. There's a whole theory that some of this stuff could be litigated on behalf of sort of the racketeering charges. Everybody says, hey, the response to a lot of things out there is to say that should be a RICO charge. And it possibly is. The racketeering act that brought down the mob. That's an entirely possible. There are legal scholars out there who have figured out how they could make that argument for this. I don't know if that has gone anywhere. I do know that state attorneys generals and some of the state secretaries of state, they are the ones responsible for the organizations that operate in that state, the charitable groups that operate in that state. So they do the enforcement. Well, right now, Jason Miyares in Virginia, the Virginia Attorney General, is starting to audit, is starting to bring Americans for Muslims in Palestine. He's starting to bring a lot of questions about their operations in his state, and is forcing them into, I don't know if it's going to be disclosures, but he is now asking these questions about that organization. Any other Secretary of State or Attorney General could do exactly the same thing. And I think once you see the first one, right, and the public could very easily then be talking to their elected officials saying, we want you to start asking these questions. And at some point, critical mass happens. There's been a discussion that if you find individuals who are not American born, who are participating in these protests or protests that cause damage or harm people, deport them. That's another strategy. I think Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas has suggested that. pushing reporters to ask the better questions about these organizations. I mean, most of us know some reporters who are out there, and that is, again, the individual I told you about, Mr. Singham, the individual married to the founder of Code Pink. There was a huge New York Times piece about it. I'll definitely share that with you in case that's something that you want to share with your folks. But it was talking about their, how he came to his viewpoints, and I don't think that many would have viewed it as a positive article. So getting other people to ask questions who are in a position to force answers from the folks that are the bad actors. These things are out there. I know that MEMRI, also the Middle East Media Research Institute, spends a lot of time looking at how there are certain imams and mosques that are incredibly outspoken in their support of Hamas and their support of the protests. And they're documenting it in ways that I think can be powerful for people to see and share. Because once you start seeing the support of the violence and the vitriol of the violence, then I think people are more willing to say, I do want to help stop doing things. I do want to help stop this in some ways, but enforcement is a huge challenge. And even getting, like I said, we are challenged by not always having access to the full financial information of these groups and following the crumbs that we have. So our first impulse is to, well, let's help list who they are, because then we can start connecting those dots. And by finding the people who are upstream for some of it, because if you see that, all of the same groups are getting money from this group that we don't know much about, and then we see a group that, we do know a lot about their funding. If they're involved, there's going to be some shared connections there. So that's how we wind up doing it. And my colleague Brian Morrow, and you can find his work at Capital Research Center, is definitely somebody who is trying to follow all of these threads and entangle and then weave them into some sort of tapestry that makes more sense to people looking on. And then we also have, like I said, with Influence Watch, we're just trying to put as many groups on there as possible.
Very
We
good.
will share the URL in the description.
Oh, yes. So do you know do you know if there are already groups organized that go against that we could join as the public?
Oh, sure.
That go against this funding or the legislation, or that are active against
I
this.
know there are a couple of very good groups on college campuses that are working very hard. I'm now blanking because I only know of them through acronyms, but that are protecting Jewish students. So I think it's the Israeli Campus Coalition, and so they are very active. So ICC, and then there's a Students for Israeli Support, I believe, SIS, and they are out there. I could have botched those two names, and if so, I apologize, but I will send you that information as soon as I'm done, because I know they are working on the campuses too. I think to start, they're certainly pushing back is one thing, but I think to start, they're trying to protect the Jewish students on campus.
Yeah, but I mean to
on the funding.
And the funding,
yeah, the groups that are there any groups or I don't know, is it organized somehow somewhere to put pressure on the right places to further stop this funding?
Yeah, I mean, what I've seen happening is say AIPAC has been, the American Israeli Political Action Committee has been very involved more on the lobbying side of things, on making and pressuring the Congress people to be doing something about this. And they engage heavily in both the normal lobbying, but they also will engage in the electeds, which is different. I know you and your audience may not be as involved in the actual elections, but they will support and oppose candidates because they're allowed to do that as a political action committee.
Yeah.
But the groups that I'm sort of seeing, the pushing back against the funding, I think, is happening more through the established sort of Jewish groups that have been there. AIPAC is probably in the lead, but there are many Jewish groups on Capitol Hill that if you're talking about this pushback, I think they're mobilizing it. But most of the people, it's been, I mean, it's it's been, I think, less happening through groups and just happening through the public outcry.
Okay.
And they're supporting. I don't know that I've seen a group that is trying. I don't think I've seen a national group that is trying to really recruit other people into pushing back, because I think most people are instinctively pushing back. I don't mean to minimize that, but I think there has been less of an attempt to organize because it's.
But if an individual listening to this podcast, what could he or she do right when they finish listening to this?
Sure. I mean, trying to push your elected officials to engage in this or to either demand enforcement from the IRS. Public hearings can be very helpful. So calling for, so these people need to be asked questions, I think is the perfect, and doing that kind of mobilization could be something that is powerful.
So let's say now a sentence, because people really need help. So
Okay.
they could write their elected official and say, I encourage you to hold a hearing on, okay, what's the rest of the sentence?
On the groups funding the protests on college campuses.
Okay, we should focus on that rather than saying about the mosques and such. In other words, to start with the college campuses.
I just know that that's something that.
No. I'm just saying, I want to make it as easy as possible.
No, I understand. And I guess it's whatever issue it is that is that is motivating. I know that the college, because it's more not popular, but it's happening in
more in the news
right now. People are seeing it. Pushing back to your alma mater, certainly we have seen so much movement from the donor bases. I think literally today, an individual resigned his position as a trustee of Brown University.
I read the editorial in the Wall Street Journal today.
Yeah, it was
very well written. I highly recommend it.
And by just saying, this is not okay, that then more donors are going to be doing exactly the same thing and holding their universities. I think part of the question is that it starts with, where do you have, as an individual, have the most power, and talking to that person. And the sentence becomes, why are we allowing a vote to support the divestment of Israel, of the BDS movement? Why are we allowing that to even take place at the Board of Trustees? And that's what motivated that donor. So I don't know if that's been helpful.
Yes, it has. I just wanted to help people understand. And we've done an interview with Alums for Campus Fairness. So we recommend that people sign up to know what their alma mater is doing and get notifications.
I'm not familiar with that group. That's wonderful.
Yeah, I'll send you the podcast we did. So I'm signed up through the Penn one, and they let us know when we need to do things. And I wouldn't say it's simple, but it's important that universities hear from alums and know what is Penn? What is that? University of Pennsylvania.
Okay. University of Pennsylvania. And I definitely, I was looking at your the people that you were inviting on your podcast and listened to a few. They're great.
Thank you.
Yes. So as we come to the end of this really fascinating conversation, some of it is a little above our heads perhaps, but it's very important. And my husband's a tax lawyer. I can't wait to tell him about what the IRS is doing. You don't get him started on the IRS not enforcing, but that's another story. Are there any last minute thoughts that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think, and one thing that we are always looking for that more information on these groups. So go to Influence Watch if you see a group out there that you think, I want to know more about them, or that it sounds fishy that a group like this should have a comment on. And this is certainly for this issue of anti-Semitism, but it works in other public policies too. Type it into Influence Watch, and if it's not there, there's a place on the website that you can type in and say, you should cover this group, you should cover that group, because that's how we know the organizations out there to start trying to find. And then
okay, let's repeat this. This is very important, everyone.
So it's Influence Watch, influencewatch.org is the website. So influence, no space, no hyphen, no nothing. Influencewatch.org is where it is. And then if you want to read the commentary or see those groups put into buckets or to put into information, please go to capitalresearch.org. It's capital with an A, so it's like money research, capitalresearch.org, which I don't think was intended when it was founded, but it works well for us now. And you will see a lot of reporting from Ryan Morrow. I mean, he took a look at all of the groups that were going to protest at the DNC and the RNC and put those in ways that are usable.
Those were the Democratic National Convention.
Apologies, yes.
And
Democratic
the Republican National Convention.
And the Republican National Convention, yes. So we tried to make sure that was out there, and it was in some ways fortunate that there wasn't as much violence done in before those than had been worried about. But with that, he also, right now, I'm just finishing reading a study that he wrote about specifically these college protests. So we are going to be publishing that on our website probably within the next couple of weeks so that you can see, and it does have a lot of more description of some of the recommended policies that are out there. And I don't want to say that we're recommending them, but they're the basically 9 countermeasures that have come up as people are talking about what do we do about this. So we've got those listed out there and who supported them and who suggested them so that people can understand, okay, this is what we should be doing. So you'll have that. You guys will have that soon, or the public will have that very soon. And then we also have the 100 or so groups that we found in that initial run of the college protests that were very commonly around. So and with the evidence of exactly why we consider them a pro-terrorist organization.
Yeah. Your work is phenomenally important and probably not known enough. So I hope that this podcast can help offset that, because it's really, really important that we know who's doing what so that then we can take steps, right? Because we know generally that there's this huge funding.
And I will tell you that in terms of some of the form, I know NGO Monitor out there, and it is a Jerusalem-based entity. It tends to focus on a lot of and do what it can to track the international funding going on, but it is more funding that is taking place internationally. And so some of it is going to be sent to the United States. So that's a good place to look for information on that. I wouldn't want to say that they're active, like I'm not trying to call them activists on that, but I do know that they are good at collecting more of that international information.
Yeah.
So
NGO Monitor. NGO Monitor.
Yep. And so that stands for Non-Governmental Organization Monitor, which is what a lot of people call this community of charitable groups or groups that are not, they're not companies, they're not formalized companies. So NGO Monitor.
Thank you, Kristen, for coming on the show and trying to explain. I mean, I know you understand. To those of us who don't really know what this is amazing information. I thank our listeners. Evelyn and I, you can learn more about us at Never Again Is Now podcast at YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And please, as we ask at the end of every show, speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.